fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. On 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and I am Al Warren. Mr. Mike Brown is back again.
Back again, like a bad rash. I keep turning up. When you least expect me, here I am.
I don't think there's any pills that will fix this.
No. Well, there's probably one pill that would make me go with cyanide. I don't want to take a cyanide pill or anything like that. But
No. Well, and I don't think the pharmacy gives you one anyway.
No.
Yeah, Canada's not going to do that to you.
Well, I mean, we do have that legalized dying here now. You know, if you want to take the more dignified way out, you can do it.
Well, great. Well, just leave that one alone.
Yeah, right.
Well, speaking of history and Canadian history, like I'm really surprised about this book and about the story, and even doing a little reading about it, I'm totally blown away. I think a lot of people are probably a little bit naive as how they think of Canada and some of the history and like what's been going on with the Indigenous children being found in graves and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of shock. I think a lot of people are still kind of not really, they can't believe what they hear type thing, right? So this story kind of fits in there. And so what we're going to be talking about is a book called Hanged in Medicine Hat, and it's Murders in a Nazi Prison of War Camp, and the disturbing true story of Canada's last mass execution. And the authors are guest Mr. Nathan Greenfield. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Wow, this is it's truly interesting story, and it kind of adds to what I was saying. First of all, let's talk about how you found out about this, because I hadn't even really heard about any of this stuff before.
Well, I wrote a book on the Canadians who fought at Hong Kong and then were prisoners of war for three and a half years. And then I wrote a book on Canadian evaders, escapers, and POWs in Europe in the Second World War. And then I wrote a book on Canadian POWs in the First World War. Somewhere in my research on this, I came across this story and filed it away. And having done the 3 books on POWs overseas, I figured that I should turn my attention to an unknown or little-known story about tens of thousands of German POWs on the Canadian prairies and, in fact, in camps dotted across the country.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of shocked me, because was the amount, and you're saying that for 3 years during the Second World War, there was 12,000 Nazis held in the camp near Medicine Hat, and looking at different articles online, it's saying that I've read that the Canadian government is responsible for over 34,000 German prisoners of war, and in 25 separate camps, and the largest being that of Medicine Hat and another one in Lethbridge, which is for people that in the States that don't know, it's kind of southern Alberta, close to the border, south of Calgary. So it's kind of in the start of the prairies, and not a lot of population there. So the first thing that came to my mind was, why was Canada housing 30,000 plus Nazi prisoners of war in Canada, and what's the process involved in that? Because we're talking about the 40s, 1940s, and if you have that many people that were being captured by the Allies, why are they shipping them all the way to Canada and then across the train into a prairie town, and that many of them? Like, what was the process there?
Well, the group in Medicine Hat primarily were from the Africa Corps. So after Rommel was defeated, the British, under whom the Canadians served, captured tens of thousands of Germans. Britain could not hold them. By that point, the Americans were in the war, and they were building the huge bases, and you needed the training grounds, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, some 3-4 million Yanks ended up in Britain, so there simply wasn't the room. Nor was there the food for them. So they were shipped out to Australia, to Canada, South Africa, and of course, after the Americans were involved, after mainly the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, the Americans also take prisoners across the sea. The U.S. ended up with some 100-odd thousand German POWs. It was the process was relatively simple. They were herded into camps in various places in North Africa. And some were shipped directly through England to the United States, some through South Africa. I was never able to determine whether there was a rhyme or reason for that. But they ended up in Canada. Many of the men I wrote about, that is to say, the two men who were executed and some of the men who killed them, arrived on the Queen Elizabeth in New York, and then were marched onto a CP train and crossed at Sarnia and onwards across the prairies. The two camps in Alberta were chosen because they were in Alberta. And that meant that you couldn't escape and get in there. The only reliable transportation at that point was the train, and the Canadians had good surveillance of the train system near the camps. During the winter, of course, if you escaped, you die because you get lost. And during the summer, you simply get lost. And it was just too far away for them to get anywhere. If they did escape, there were no successful escapes from the camps. Those two camps. There were from other camps in New Brunswick and elsewhere. But from those two camps, there were no successful escapes, and they couldn't have gotten anywhere. And that was the cabinet documents state that clearly, that they're chosen because there is no way to get out.
What was the camp like? Okay, so when you describe the camp, how would you tell people how these prisoners lived? Like, what was it like? Anything we've seen, or
I can say they lived very well. Most of them put on 22 pounds.
Wow.
On average. The camps had hot showers and indoor toilets at a time when hot showers were not common on the prairies. The camps there were any number of activities, from sports to theater to education activities in the camps. The prisoners were allowed an unlimited amount of mail. Tons of mail came in and went out. And I know your American listeners won't understand this with the way I say it, but I'll explain in a second. Prisoners were allowed to order from a very special Eaton's mail order catalog to send stuff back to their families in Germany.
Wow.
And our American listeners think the Sears Roebuck catalog.
Yeah.
Yeah. Eaton's was a little, I think it was a little higher end, wasn't it?
Not so much its catalog at the time.
Right.
Yeah. We have records of German POWs in the camps ordering stockings to be sent to their girlfriends, wives, or wives and girlfriends, whom I don't know. And all the shipping went through neutral Turkey or neutral Sweden. There was special chocolate that Eaton's made for the men to send back that wouldn't melt. So they lived rather well.
That's really interesting to me. I just covered the internment of Japanese Canadians on my show, Dark Poutine, and the Japanese Canadians weren't treated so well. It's really fascinating, and these were Canadian citizens who were treated poorly. It's strange that German POWs, people who we were at war with, were treated so well.
Well, there was a good reason for it, besides Canada wanted to be punctilious in its following of Geneva, and that is the hope that the Germans would then treat their POWs, that is to say, our boys, well. So it was a bit of a, not quite tit for tat, because that's usually negative, but in that sense, that they were treated well, and also that they would send home, in their letters home, they would praise their treatment. And as 1942 gave way to 43 and into 44, the food situation in Germany deteriorated greatly. Now, there was never mass starvation, but there were shortages, and things like chocolate and milk were not available. And you'd get, this letter from your husband, boyfriend, son, cousin, saying, well, we just had Christmas dinner, and, I had a whole turkey and, 5 pints of milk or something like that, as well as beer. They could buy beer. So there was a bit of propaganda involved also in why they were treated so well.
Right. Now the center, a big part of the story is really focused on how the camp ran from the inside.
Right.
Like, so maybe explain that, because, okay, so you've got a prison camp, and people are thinking Hogan's Heroes
and they're not wrong. Hogan's Heroes actually gets a lot of things right. People laugh at me when I say that. But if you think of it, the Colonel Klink never issues an order to a POW. He tells Sergeant Schultz, who tells Colonel Hogan, who then issues the order.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel Hogan would be what the Germans call the man of confidence. That is to say, the spokesperson for the camp. And that he was in command of all of the men all of the Allied men in the camp. Now, where Hogan's Heroes gets wrong is that their bunk is multinational, and that was almost never true. But you have to do that for dramatic purposes. And when someone breaks the rules, gets caught doing something, they have to go to Dakula, as Sergeant Schultz would say, and that's how it happened. That's what happened. You got sent to the Kula. The term is correct, for what was called a strafe, which is punishment. And, you could be in it for, 3 days for, let's say, not saluting Colonel Klink, or you could be in it for a week if you were caught with the wrong kind of pen, or you could be in it for a month if you were caught escaping. And that was all. So in an odd way, Hogan's Heroes gets those important details right. The other thing that gets right is that the men, and I think I used the phrase in this book and another, POWs were off the chessboard. That is to say, they were no longer in the battlefield, but they were still men at war. And both German and British, and hence the Canadian, military code enjoined the POWs, their men who become POWs, who might become POWs, to try to escape, if at all possible. So again, in Hogan's Heroes, they're constantly escaping through that tree trunk.
Right.
But so it also gets that right, that the aim, you wanted to tie up German resources. After the Great Escape, there were tens of thousands of German soldiers who were mobilized, who were not on the front. So you and you tied up resources because it meant you had to have, in the case of the Canadians, we call them scouts in our camps, and they were the men who went looking for tunnels, for contraband like knives or maps or things like that. So if you were just guarding the fence, let's say, you could probably have half the company that you needed to do the camp if you're going to be looking for tunnels and going through stuff, just because of manpower is manpower. You can't be up on the in the tower and also searching a hut.
When you get to the crux of it, in a way, they're kind of running their own people. They're running their own show.
Yes, within the wire, and that the term is important. In the Canadian camps, they had the fences, and maybe there was about a 10-foot verge, and then a wire, basically at ankle length. And if you stepped over the wire, you could be shot. Mm-hmm. Except if you were going to pick up a soccer ball, every POW had a white flag to wave while he was going to get a soccer ball. But within the wire, the Germans, or as Hogan's Heroes, Hogan, the Germans more or less ran everything. Discipline was up to what was meted out by the Germans. They decided where the mail would be distributed, which gave them tremendous psychological power over the other POWs, because they could cut off the mail delivery to this or that German POW for whatever reason they wanted, in fact. So they ran the show. They did the cooking. Several of the cooks in Camp 132 were cooks before the war, and in fact, their cooking was better than the cooking for the guards. And one particular guard wrote a memoir, and he talks about how the dinner of 1940, I think it was 1942, it could have been 43, the best Christmas dinner he ever had was cooked by the Germans. So they legally ran the show within the wire. That's and Geneva recognizes that.
So how were the people living in the towns close by to any of these camps, and were they happy that they had the camps close to them? And also, wouldn't it be a little bit disturbing to them that maybe that these Nazis and prisoners of war were probably living as good and maybe in some cases better than them?
We don't have anything about their thoughts about how the men were living in the camp. There is one document I found where the Ottawa is a little concerned about the amount of chocolate that is going to Medicine Hat, and it was asked to keep the amount quiet because there was a chocolate shortage at that point in the rest of Canada. So that's in terms of how they thought about it. They were very happy the camp was in Medicine Hat. It brought a lot of jobs. Medicine Hat had suffered terribly during the Depression. And it led to a new waterworks being built, a new generator being built, so that it provided jobs. There was not all that much interaction between the Hatters, as they're called, and the POWs, although the Hatters did see them regularly on walks. They would go on parole walks in town, and that was true in Germany, too. Parole being your promise not to escape. The people around Medicine Hat were quite used to having German POWs, all of whom were not Nazis, I guess I should say, quite used to having German POWs around because they worked in the fields and in the forests of Alberta and the rest of Canada. In fact, just as a sidebar, at the end of the war, in a camp, not Medicine Hat, but another camp on the prairies, it was first captured, first sent home. And so the war's over. They're sending home those who've been in the camp the longest, and they put up the list on it, saying next Tuesday these 200 men will be being repatriated to Germany. And the man of confidence looks at the list, goes to the commandant, and says, "You cannot send him, and him." Why can't I? They are married and have children. They married and had children on the farms.
Oh.
Do you want to be the assistant deputy minister who goes to the deputy minister to say, sir, we have a problem?
Yeah.
So there was not an awful lot of, there was not really that kind of animosity you might expect. The book opens with a story of Joyce Reeser, whom I interviewed. She's since passed on. And she and the Glee Club performed in the camp for Christmas of 1942. So the girls' Glee Club from the Medicine Hat School went into the camp and did a concert. Her mother was the conductor of the Glee Club, and they were there. And of course, everybody cried when they sang "White Christmas," which was the hit song of that.
Now that we've kind of got a setting of what this camp was like and where it was and what was going on, how did the story that you are titled about, the hanged in Medicine Hat, come about? Like, what was the basic crime that happened?
Well, there were two. In 1943, Private August Plazac was murdered, and in 1944, Carl Lehman, who was a translator for the Luftwaffe, North Africa, both of them were Afrika Korps, was executed. I use the term slightly differently. Plazak's murder was not premeditated. What had happened was the German leadership had heard that there were perhaps going to be an attempt by former French foreign legionnaires who had then become members of the Wehrmacht and were sent into the Afrika Korps to against the camp leadership, which was becoming increasingly Nazified. There wasn't going to be. But they investigated several former legionnaires, and it got out that some were being investigated in this particular hut, and there was basically a riot. and Private Schultz, he ran, got over the wire, and was protected by the Canadians. But then there was this angry mob which descended upon the West the hut where this was they were taking place. They seized Plazek. He was hung. The men who did it were guilty of murder, no doubt. But it was not a premeditated. That's why I didn't use the word executed. Drawing a slight legal distinction between the two. In the case of Lehman, they were going to be moving several thousand members of the camp in 1944 to Nyes, Ontario, to make room for POWs captured in Normandy. And they were sending the most Nazified. There was a schema they had for determining level of Nazification, with not being Nazified white and the most being Nazified being black. So they were sending the camp leadership and their supporters out of the camp to Nyes, Ontario, which was even more isolated than Medicine Hat. The night before, they were going to be leaving at 4 a.m. That night, Carl Lehman was called to the West Recreation Hut, where he was going to sign. He was a teacher also in camp. Sign diplomas, and he was killed there. He was by 4, 5 POWs, and his body was found the next day. And then so they've been investigating the Plazek murder for a year before Lehman was murdered. And then they have the investigations, become concurrent at a certain point. The RCMP and military intelligence hit a stone wall time after time. Things are looking pretty good. I have all the documents of the investigations, and they're saying we think we're going to break this case, in the next week or so, and then everything dries up. Finally, after the end of the war in 1945, an anonymous letter is left on a typewriter in Nyes, Ontario, detailing, well, not so much detailing, but sketching out who did what. And that breaks the case, because that gives the RCMP the firepower to start calling men in and saying, we know all of this. What else can you tell us? And then people start talking. And that led to the indictments, and then finally the trials in 1946.
These were just outright murders. But they were sort of trying to run their own camp from inside. So most of the men in the camp sort of believed in the justice that they admit that they murdered these people, I would guess.
Yes, I mean there were again in the testimony we have. One POW said, "Well, do you know who did it?" He says, "Yeah, but I'm not going to tell you. I'm a good German." Mm-hmm. So there were a couple of brave souls who came forward, and one guy left a memoir lying around, and it was picked up by the RCMP, and it gave more information. So they were able to break the code of silence, so to speak. And that led again to the first trial was for the killers of Plazek. That led to one execution, one long-term imprisonment, and one exoneration, and then the trials for Lehman. Again, the killing of Plazek is he was suspect of having been involved. There was never any proof that involved in a subversion of the camp. Never any proof, and it really was a mob action. In fact, in the trial, the Crown Attorney says, "I'm going to try this case as if we're trying it under the Riot Act," although they didn't, because that would allow guilt by not association is the wrong word, but guilt by you were also present at the time this took place. In the Lehman's case, it was a much more. There had been concerns about him. By the way, the records show that he in fact was a traitor. So in that sense, they were right. He was helping and giving information to the Canadian authorities. They did not have any proof of that, but they suspected it. Nor did they know that before the war, he had been a communist. or at least a very active socialist. So he was one who would be fingered relatively easily.
So basically, these in-camp prisoners had decided to kill these two people mainly because they considered them to be traitors or against the German way. Now, within the camp itself, you talk about the kind of like the hierarchy or how it ran. So you sort of suggest that there's even its own shadow Nazi government. It kind of maybe talk about what you mean there.
Well, it wasn't shadow; it was quite there. I mean, the man of confidence was elected by the various block leaders, who were elected by the men in the huts. Block is the other word for hut, and so that it was quite clear who the camp leadership was. It became more and more Nazified, especially after the bomb plot, in 1944, and the orders were issued by the ranking German prisoner in Canada, Lieutenant General Schmidt, who was not at Medicine Hat. He was at Bowmanville in Ontario. But he was the ranking, and he issued orders which were carried to Medicine Hat to be good Nazis. And then after the bomb plot, they had a radio, a secret radio, and they heard Hitler's orders to execute anyone who was a traitor. And the traitor they had in their sights was Karl Lehmann, and so he was duly executed by the camp leadership.
So this is really complex, legally, diplomatically, in regard to the Geneva Convention. Holy smokes! How does this get prosecuted and defended?
Well, oddly, there's a problem there, and that's why the subtitle is "The Disturbing a True Story." It was prosecuted in civilian court, which it should not have been. Both Geneva and, for that matter, the applicable Canadian law, the War Measures Act, stipulate that serious trials of POWs, things were not for theft, let's say, must be in military court. I was never able to find the cabinet document to explain why it was in civilian court. I did find several cabinet documents saying that it will be in civilian court because the RCMP was the lead investigator. But that's really not, from our point of view today, legally enough to explain it. That's more the mechanical question. So it's in civilian court, which means that although the judge was a World War I veteran, not all of the men, and they were only men at that point, a six-person jury, because in Alberta that was allowed because of small population. Not all of them had a military background. So understanding even the military code was not necessarily the strong point of the juries. And then, of course, you have the added complexity of understanding the relationship between the military code and the Geneva Convention.
So when you think about it in one way, I could see why Canadian military would want those people prosecuted and executed because they were killing their spies. But on the other hand, why couldn't the camp administer its own punishment?
Well, by 1946, of course, killing their own spies would have no impact because the war's long over.
Right.
So if you want to go down that road, they should have actually just released them. The issue came down, and in the camp isn't allowed to discipline beyond a certain level of discipline. For example, trying to escape 30 days in isolation or things like that. So we have killings. So it was judged to come under the Metropolitan, that is the Canadian Criminal Code, and hence must be prosecuted. The defense especially the Lehman trial, the argument was made at the Plaza trial, but the Lehman trials was made much more in much more detail, is that the POWs were following orders. Now, Nuremberg was going on at the same time, and Nuremberg had already rejected the "I was just following orders" defense, but that is nowhere stated in the trials that Nuremberg had rejected it. Nor, for that matter, was Nuremberg as clear on that as mythology tells us.
So it wasn't established as precedent at the time.
Well, let's say the precedent was forming, but the precedent was fudgy at certain areas. So, for example, Karl Donitz was able to use the "I was just following orders" defense, and it was accepted. Others, it was not accepted. So, as I say, mythology has it that Nuremberg established that as a hard and fast rule. That is not true. It's only later that it becomes a hard and fast, not even sure it's hard and fast rule now, but it's a hard and fast urban legend, if I can put it that way. So the trial never refers to that, but the issue of following orders comes down to the question of the wire. If the territory within the wire is governed by German officers, then it's governed by German officers. Now, that brings us to another point that's raised in the book, dealing with homosexuality. And I'm not the slightest bit interested in men's sex lives. The importance of homosexuality in the trials is it was used by both the defense and the prosecution to try to throw mud at various witnesses, but that the Canadian authorities accepted, that is, they allowed the German military authorities to take discipline men for homosexual offenses, which were against the German military code as well as the Canadian military code, not to mention Canadian the civilian code, Canadian criminal code. By allowing that, and those were called degradation ceremonies, they were awful. Men were marched in front of hundreds or thousands of men. Their epaulets were torn off. The arms of their tunics were ripped off, and then in many cases they were basically left there to be beaten to a pulp by the symboled German soldiers. By allowing that to take place many times, the Canadian authorities, I argue, recognized the perseverance of German military law once you went over the wire. They did this. So the argument put forward that they were following the orders that were legal orders of Adolf Hitler, in the sense that the Third Reich regime was the legal government of Germany, recognized by England, France, Canada, the United States, Soviet Russia prior to the war. And no country ever withdrew its recognition of the legal status of the Hitlerian government. So that the men were issued, I would argue, it's an abhorrent order, but it has all the hallmarks of a legal order.
Now these guys, so if you were caught in a homosexual act and they decided they were going to prosecute you, so to speak, within the Nazi camp, so when they take you and rip off your awards and different things and they beat you, let's say, even to death. Now, was anything ever administered toward the people that gave these prisoners the beating? In
the records I've seen, no one was ever beaten to death. Some were very badly beaten.
Yeah, but so if they say they caught you were doing something, they thought it was bad, so they took you and stripped you and they beat you up and threw you in the thing. Now, for the people that did that to that prisoner that was homosexual, were they ever punished for doing that?
Usually not. There is one case, however, where soldiers were punished, and in fact they were convicted in a civilian court in a country that has outlawed homosexuality and its military outlawed homosexuality. But these, I think it's 4 or 5 men, were convicted and served a spate in jail. It's very odd. It's a very odd thing to read that these men were, tried and convicted for beating up homosexuals when in fact this was something that was, almost perfectly legal in Canada at the time.
So it sounds like there might be a lot of feelings or emotions or some sort of political motivation between the people that were, some of them getting prosecuted, some of them not. It might have been who they were and who their friends or enemies were.
Could have been. We don't know why these particular men were prosecuted. We do know they were. So my guess is that what happened is a camp guard came across, the bloodied private or corporal or whomever he was. Asked what happened. He was told, and they rounded the men up, and they said, "Yeah, we beat him up." He was after the degradation ceremony. I mean, I wouldn't go looking for anything terribly complex because there's nothing in the records to indicate complexity.
Right. And I would say that probably the majority of the people thought that was an illegal and a bad thing. The homosexual act itself was considered quite bad back in that time. So in the average mind, they would have thought, oh, well, he deserved it or whatever.
Well, yes, exactly. And that's so in the trials, that's why homosexuality becomes important, as I said, for 2 reasons. One is because both the prosecution and the defense use it to throw mud at various witnesses. And then because for the defense, it's also a question of whether or not German law is followed within the wire. And it led to Judge Howson's line, which is my favorite one in the book, from the judge: "I am of the opinion that the Medicine Hat, the POW camp in Medicine Hat, is in Canada," because there had been a motion for him to rule that it was not part of Canada, which then went up to appeal, and more or less the same thing was said. In fact, it went up to the Governor General because of they were death sentences, and the Governor General refused to use his prerogative. So it was one of the defenses all the way up.
Wow. Now, do you think, in your own opinion, that if it would have been tried, both these crimes, in a military court, things would have been different?
I think there might have been there could have been differences in the case of Plazek, and in the case of Lehman, the issue of what following orders means under certain circumstances is something that could really only be understood when you understand the military code, which is never real. I mean, it was presented in court, but it was never fully explained. That's not the place for it. I should add that in South Africa, there was a similar situation, which the Canadian government was well aware of, because the 2 men who were accused of killing someone had been transferred to Canada, and South Africa investigators had to come to Canada to interview them. They were then sent back to South Africa, stood trial, and it also was oddly in civilian court. I don't know why, but and it was a death sentence that had been ruled by the jury, but the judge overruled and said that men cannot be held completely responsible for their actions in the artificial world of a prison camp. So that and the Canadian government knew that and allowed the execution to go forward. Similar cases in the United States were tried in military court. Some led to conviction, some did not. But I've been asked what would happen today, and the trials probably would have been declared a mistrial on day 1 in many cases. But I don't think today you could not enter you could not use the homosexual evidence as a way of discrediting witnesses. You would only be allowed to use it as a way of showing the perseverance of German military law. So it would have a very different function in a courtroom today. I mean, at one point, the Crown prosecutor says, "Let us take a step deeper into the mire," when talking about homosexuality in the camp. I mean, a phrase like that would lead to a mistrial,
Yeah.
as it should.
Yeah.
So,
Well, do
in that
you
sense-
think that if we actually had a prisoner of war camp today, like things were going on right now, some war, and we had that now, do you think that in these days we would actually let them administer their own punishments?
we wouldn't have any choice. The Geneva Convention demands it.
Oh, so that would still go on today? Like there would be.
Well, for example, Ukraine is getting hundreds of, if not thousands per day, Russian POWs. At some point, there's going to be a problem housing them.
Right. Yeah.
And because I've done so much work on POWs, I've been asked, well, what do you think? And I've said, well, we're a big country. I just drove to Kamloops. My wife and I just drove to Kamloops to visit our son and daughter-in-law and my 10-month-old stepson, and then we drove back to the States. It's a big country if you out there. Nye, Ontario is still there. I saw the sign for it. So it's not. This is spinning out a web, but let's assume they asked. Could we hold these men? And let's assume we said yes. Well, we would immediately be under the rules of the Geneva Convention.
Well, we'll put them in Winnipeg.
That's only because of the weather.
Well, it'd be tough to escape, right? In winter, you would freeze.
But they would really want to.
Yeah.
There were lots of places in this country you couldn't escape from, even in the summer.
Yeah.
so remote.
Yeah.
But no, we would immediately fall under the rules of the Geneva Convention, which has changed. We're now the Geneva Convention of 1949, not 1929, but it is essentially the same for the question of POWs. So, what I think would be very different would be the how prisoners of war that there would be much more effort to structure their days so that you don't have masses of men standing around doing nothing, which is bad for them and bad for camp discipline.
Right. There would be more activity, more work or something.
Yeah, there would be more activities. As I said, we did have educational activities. There were thousands of German POWs who went home with university degrees. I, in fact, when writing my first book on the Battle of St. Lawrence at Queen's University, I actually found I should have made a copy of it, I didn't, of a SS officer crossing at graduation in full uniform to get his diploma.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, he was an SS officer, and he was entitled to get his diploma in public. As I said, there were thousands. There was lots of sports activities. There was movies, et cetera, et cetera. Because POWs are not criminals. I'm writing about criminals. POWs are prisoners because they represent the country. It's a very important difference. And they're also different than regular prisoners because they do not know when their sentence will end.
Yeah, it's quite a different concept here. They haven't been convicted of any crime.
No, they're not, and they're not guilty of any crime ipso facto. I mean, they are representatives of the government with which you are at war. But they are not criminals, unless they do something that is illegal. They are not criminals, which makes them a very different, very different kettle of fish, as it were.
Now, so when you went through the research and put together the book, were there things that sort of surprised you, even though you're sort of into the history and been studying it anyway? Was there something that came up that you weren't expecting?
In the investigation, I was a little surprised at how naive the RCMP could be about some of the people. There was the ranking German. There's only one officer in the camp, Dr. Nolt. He was the captain, and he clearly was involved in all sorts of shenanigans and was clearly involved in disciplining POWs that he should not have been because he was a doctor and the Hippocratic Oath, etc. And the RCMP seemed to be bamboozled by him from the very beginning. It was only later on that they realized that they'd been taken for a ride. In the trials, there was great fun in the trials because there was at one point so with Plazik is hit as he's coming into being pulled to the hut where he's hit, the West Recreation Hall where he's killed. He is hit with either a piece of earth or a piece of clay, a heavy piece of earth or a heavy piece of clay. And the two words in German are very close, Boden and Baden, I think. And there were the trial transcripts, for those of you who've never seen them, are on long legal document pages. So they're very long. There's lots of text. There was 6 or 7 pages of trying to determine the correct translation of this clod of earth. And finally, the judge said, I think we understand that earth is clay and clay is earth, at least in this courtroom.
Yeah.
And then there were moments of levity. A number of POWs refused to kiss the Bible because they believed in the sword. One tried to get around it by kissing his thumb, holding it and kissing his thumb. The judge blew his top and started screaming, "There will be no thumb kissing in my court." So, there are those sorts of moments and translations of I demanded the rope or I asked for the rope, and what that distinction might mean in a court of law.
Right.
So it's I guess I wasn't expecting to find some moments of levity in the courtroom. Nor was I expecting to find that at the end of the story, there were a couple of cabinet minutes that the Louis Saint Laurent, who was Minister of Justice, appears to have supported clemency, that is to say, Governor General commuting the sentence. But he leaves office, and James Isley is appointed because he doesn't leave office yet. He goes down to Lake Success, New York, to be at the founding of the United Nations. And he is replaced by James Isley, who a short while later replaces him. And in one memo document, it suggests that Saint Laurent was averse to the executions. Of course, it says that Isley is not averse to the executions. So if you're going to specify that you are not averse and you are the acting, then it implies that there is an averse that you're not following. So I suggest in the conclusion of the book that the change of justice minister may have had a role to play in the executions.
How did the country react to the whole thing, the trial and the executions? Did they take it to heart, or were they happy? Like, what do you know what the response was?
Page 6.
Yeah.
By December 1946, I think it may have been page 8. I think the first execution probably did make the front pages of some papers, but usually short. Again, this was during the time of Nuremberg, so there was, there was a sort of, I would assume by most people, a sort of blending of the two that went on in terms of Nazis on the trial, going through Nazis who have been tried and convicted, and the early trials do make the front pages, but very quickly we're on page 3 and page 5 of the because people went on, to do much. We're sick of the war. It was 46. At one point in the book, I actually show that I think it's one of the convictions is on page 4 or 5 of the medicine hat paper, right next to an ad for laundry soap. So you're beginning. It's really no longer. It's not an issue in the public mind,
Right.
Which is why it's not particularly well known, I suppose.
Yeah.
Even though it is. It is. I guess the executions in 1946. As I'm thinking about it now, was actually the last act of the Canadians in the Second World War. Now, one other thing I should add is that in June of 1945, not June, May of 1945, 2 days before the German surrender, the two Germans defect to the Canadian lines, in Holland. So the Canadians have them.
Mm-hmm.
The war is over 2 days later. The Germans commander on the other side, because they took a while to, of course, take control of everything. So the Germans still were controlling the water and electricity of this, over the river in Holland, wherever this was, till the Canadians could move in force. Came to the Canadians and said, "You have these guys. They have defected. They are traitors. We want to execute them in a drumhead court." Not only did we hand them over, but we gave them the guns to execute them. So after the extinguishment of the Nazi state, it had ceased to exist. The Canadian army, all the way up to, the commander of the Canadians in Holland, said that it was okay to hand these guys over and for them to be executed under the laws, military law of a country, or at least a regime, that had ceased to exist. By the same logic, in 1944, when that country has another year and a half of existence, its laws should have been recognized.
Well, this is a fascinating story, fascinating book, and we recommend it totally. Of course, we're going to have it up on our website. People can find it with one click. The book is called Hanged in Medicine Hat, Murders in a Nazi Prison of War Camp, and the disturbing true story of Canada's last mass execution. Our guest is the author, Nathan Greenfield. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Yeah. Good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.